Thanks for having me again. That's very nice. I will talk about whole life carbon, of course, and the resource use in buildings, which result in whole life carbon emissions. Right. So I want to start with some numbers. I guess these numbers change a little bit depending on where in Europe you are, but in general, we see more or less that 40% of all our extracted materials in the EU is consumed by the building sector. That 40% of all our generated waste is construction and demolition waste. That about 40% of all our greenhouse gas emissions come from the building stock. So that would mean both operational and embodied carbon. And something which we've started to look at more closely in this year, I would say, from the Commission side, is about sufficiency. We see how about 40% of all buildings in the EU are unused or underused. So these are big numbers, and of course it is because, well, many of those numbers are because we are using so much materials of our, of the total material use that we have goes to the sector. If we look at the building stock, we see something. We see that this one shows for one typical standard year, a base year of 2020 without COVID. So that gives you a good idea of what we're talking about. We see how 79% of the whole life carbon is operational carbon, and about 21% is embodied carbon. Now, this can look like, okay, well then it's the operational one that we should focus on. But we need to remember that the building stock is based or is made up of all kinds of buildings in various stages of their life cycle. By far, most buildings are, if I may say so, just standing there and being used, being operated. But there are just a few percent of buildings which are being built new every year. And even a lower percentage, smaller percentage, which are being renovated. And some also coming to the end of life. And it is those specific moments, new build, renovation, refurbishment, and end of life, which are the primary sources to embodied carbon. Also, maintenance actually plays an important role, as you probably can see here. No, you cannot. But maintenance is for us in our study, it was a surprisingly big contribution to embodied carbon as well. And that is, of course, because all buildings, more or less, are maintained, right? But there are fewer which are renovated, for example. So we saw that renovation and maintenance actually are more or less the same contribution to embodied carbon. But by far the biggest one is the new build, so the upfront carbon. If we zoom in on embodied carbon specifically, we can see that the majority indeed comes from construction, so new buildings. We see that although only a few percent of our buildings are new built every year, they still contribute to 15% of our total whole life carbon emissions. So it means that it's really those new buildings represent really a carbon hotspot. And it is primarily the upfront carbon which we are talking about, and that we can see here. Here we see something else. While on the previous slide we saw the building stock, so all our buildings. Here we see an individual building, so during its whole life cycle, as opposed to the whole building stock at 1 year. What we see here is, of course, first the operational carbon, which is the yellow, which is happening throughout the whole use of the building. And then we have the embodied carbon emissions, which, contrary to the operational carbon, more happens in specific moments, specific activities, shorter spurs of time. So obviously it is the upfront carbon at the very beginning, which has the highest emissions, but then you see also that it comes back during regulation and end of life. So this is a typical building. Of course, it can look very different depending on if the building is a very high energy efficiency or not, and what material went into your building. But this is quite a standard way of looking at it. What I think is really interesting as well is that if we think about our climate objectives to 2050, from which we are 25 years from now, if we just cut that graph, if we just sort of imagine that we cut it at 25 years, then the embodied carbon becomes even more important, right? Obviously, we care a lot about what happens after 2050 as well, but it's true that we have set ourselves the objectives of climate neutrality by 2050. So building a lot of new buildings with a very high energy efficiency is not the solution for becoming climate neutral by 2050. That's for sure. Then, of course, there are many levers to consider when we, in policy, that we would like to tackle with policy in order to reduce whole life carbon emissions. We can look at the sufficiency aspect and see how can we use our buildings more effectively so that we don't need to buy new buildings or need to construct new buildings, we can look at how we use the material more efficiently. We can use the energy in our buildings more efficiently. The material or the energy that we still use can be produced with a low carbon footprint. There are many ways of looking at it. And for that reason, there are quite a lot of policy initiatives already, or legislation, pieces of legislation, which has an impact on whole life carbon of buildings in different ways. Some of these, I will not go through them all, don't worry, but just to say that some of them tackle embodied carbon, some of them tackle operational carbon, and some of them tackle both in one way or the other. So just to show that it is a big mix. None of them, I would say, really tackle whole life carbon emissions of buildings in a sharp way. For example, the ETS, of course, tackles the embodied carbon of materials, but not necessarily at the building level, if you see what I mean. So that personally, I think is still missing. That's my personal view. I pick out one of these pieces of legislation, though, because it's very recent. It has been revised very recent, and for the first time we have included whole life carbon. So this is the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. It was the revision of it went on for a few years, and it was adopted in spring. And for the first time now, we have the obligation to calculate and to report on whole life carbon. And also, very interestingly, I believe, member states have to produce their national roadmaps on how they're going to reduce this. So this comes on top of many other articles which refer more specifically to the operational carbon, operational energy, sorry, I should say. You are also, I'm sure, very familiar, many of you, with the CPR, the Construction Product Regulation, which is dealt with by our colleagues in DG GROW, DG GROW, while the EPPD is dealt with by our colleagues in DG ENER. You may not care about where in the Commission it's dealt with, but I just want to stress that those different parts of the Commission are working very closely together with each other, because of course they are very much linked to each other. What we're doing, what we try to achieve, and the instruments that we are respectively in charge of are very much linked to one another. I got this slide from our colleagues in DG GROW working on the construction product regulation and how they see it, and of course it coincides very much with how we see it as well. So the construction product regulation has also been revised, and for the first time there is the obligation to report on the product level on global warming potential. So this then feeds into levels, which I will not talk more about, but it is a methodology that we have developed to assess a lot of different things, the sustainability aspect of buildings, but also including, there is an indicator on whole life carbon. And it is based on that levels indicator then that we can take this into different kinds of legislation, such as the taxonomy or the EPPD, things like that. So I quite often get the question, yeah, but now when we have it in the EPPD, what's the role of levels then? For those of you who are a little bit familiar or have heard of levels before. But levels is really the common language. It's the basis on which we can then put this into different kinds of policies. So this is quite a nice visualization of the chain and the way we see it. I also want to stress that we are working on a roadmap for the reduction of whole life carbon. I just mentioned that member states will have to produce their national roadmaps with numbers and all. That is not the role for the Commission to do, but we will still have a whole life carbon roadmap, which is more setting the scene, describing a little bit of what I showed you now, but also other things, and what a whole life carbon approach, more specifically on buildings, could result in. So that is coming, and for that reason, we had last summer we had a public consultation on this with good attendance. Maybe some of you answered, I don't know. But anyway, a lot of, I would say, positive results in how the sector itself sees the importance of whole life carbon and what are the possibilities to do something about it, to reduce whole life carbon, basically. So the respondents to this, they were highly confident about both the potential that a lot of measures that could be done at a building project, the potential that this would have to reduce whole life carbon, but also the feasibility of doing it, actually. So not just saying, yeah, there are good ways of doing it, but it's kind of hard. No, they said it was both feasible and it would lead to a substantial reduction. They were also stressing that although we have this package of different kinds of pieces of legislation that I showed you before, that there is a need for more of a robust whole life carbon in buildings policy, which they felt were lacking. This is needed in order to actually get the ball rolling throughout the EU. There was, I think, to my surprise, an overwhelming support for mandatory whole life carbon emission maximum values. 85% said that this would be necessary and useful to have. About half of those, so 40-something% of the total respondents wanted this more or less immediately to come into place in a mandatory way, while the other half, so another 40% something, said, yeah, we need it, but we should start on a voluntary way and then make them mandatory a few years down the line. There was a clear role for the EU to develop a harmonized methodology for this, but the benchmark, so the target values, or whatever we want to call it, there was a strong view that this should be set at a national level. And this is actually very much what is happening now with, as a result of the revised EPPD, because remember that these results came before we had the final version of the revised EPPD. The Commission is now working on to produce this harmonized methodology. It is very much levels, but we will do certain tweaks to levels so that it will fit even better into this very sharp legislation, which levels was not necessarily intended for in the beginning. I think I skipped that. And I also wanted to say that, remember that I said 40% of our generated waste is construction demolition waste. We have studies which show that if we were increasing the circularity of this waste with available technologies, we can reduce our whole life carbon emissions substantially already now. The second point there refers to that there is mandatory there is obligations in the Waste Framework Directive about selective demolition and separate collection, but it is not happening to the extent that we would like it to do. So there is now considerations of how to step up this further. Pre-demolition audits are crucial to get to that, and as you probably know, there is a new protocol available for this as well. And interestingly, I think the EU is developing end of waste criteria. They should be ready by 2027. We have a new commission coming up, you know that, with new mandates. It will be very much linked to making sure that we can fine-tune the Green Deal, the European Green Deal, and make sure that it's still fit for purpose and continue to be so. Circular economy will continue to play an important role there. We will have the Circular Economy Act, which is very much linked to the end of life, how to make sure that we have both the supply and the demand for secondary raw materials, and also to have the right economics for a fair and free market on that. I see my timing is running out, but I will, so yeah, the affordable housing and clean industrial deal will also have a clear impact on buildings, and also the sustainability of buildings, of course, and these are big topics in the coming commission. With that, I want to thank you. Have a look at where we are, and I just want to say that we have a online conference on the 10th of December, so if you're interested, please take up your phones and scan that. And with that, I leave.